Welcome back to Finding the Edge podcast. I'm Garrett Boyum, joined with Robert Fry and AJ Ferrara, and we have on today uh, a former guest of the podcast, Max Bay. And so we're excited to have Max back on, and we wanted to, in some ways, I think the best way to put it is just to catch up with you again, Max. I mean, you went into professional baseball, came back out, and so usually when that happens, like that doesn't happen a ton, where someone as talented as you goes in and comes back out, because usually when you go in, you can't talk anymore. So coming back out, yeah, I appreciate you coming back on the podcast. So in some ways, I think the best place to start is just to kind of get an update on yourself. You know, your experience in professional baseball, and then what led you to make the move out of professional baseball back into kind of hitting up the podcast circuit a little bit. Because I heard you on was it Rate and Barrel? I think I might have gotten that a little mixed up, but yeah, I heard you on there, and you were talking about the new batting metrics, which is also something we wanted to kind of cover today. So, anyways, let's jump back. Yeah, tell us about your experience and where you're at now.
Let's begin. Analyzing. Finding the edge.
Oh, thanks, Garrett. Thanks for having me on, guys. Good to be back. My background's different. I've gone back and seen clips from that podcast, which was also recorded, and I was in a rocking chair, which was a huge production mistake. Um, I, I think I'm going to avoid that from here on out. Lesson learned. I just looked crazy rocking back and forth. Anyway, yeah. So I guess if the first question is, what am I doing now? I am a data science consultant for a venture studio, basically helping some startups with their data science needs.
Mhm.
So broadly, that's what I'm up to now. Um, why did I leave baseball? That's a whole nut to uncrack. But I'll say that I really enjoyed my time with the Astros, and that there were a lot of reasons to stay. That life has a way of throwing curveballs at you, as do pitchers in baseball. Is this a bad metaphor? What am I doing here? Anyway, so I ultimately left because it made more sense for my life and my family.
Mhm.
Um, but along the way, met some really exceptional individuals, and was part of a really, I would say, exceptional team, that yeah, I learned a whole lot from.
So, with that, what would just, obviously you can't go into excruciating detail, but of the things that you can share, what was your experience like in professional baseball? And then maybe two, to kind of help try to constrain to afford. What types of things would you recommend for people who are looking to get into professional baseball? Based now that you have actually gone and lived that experience, what would you share with people about the experience, and what other people who might be looking to get into it, what should they consider and think about when they're looking to get into analytics in professional baseball?
So what was my experience like overall?
Hmm.
It was really positive. I only worked for one team, but that team has institutional memory and institutional practices that go back a while, not decades and decades and decades, because analytics isn't that old,
Hmm.
but do go back a while. A lot of the formative members of this field, if you want to call it that, joined the Astros, right? So like Mike Fast was there at one point. It just has that kind of history there. Um, the uh, the approaches taken are very scientific, and I think there's a genuine desire to understand the game from as close to first principles as possible, um, because that's where real insights occur. um, I think that there are probably teams, probably individuals who are satisfied with making predictions using, essentially just like performance output without caring too much about what the upstream causal factors are. Um, you know, anyway, yeah, I'm kind of rambling. I think that my experience was so good because the practices there were really fantastic. Um, I felt like I fit in there philosophically. Um, but yeah, every team's going to operate its own way, and I have no idea what the other teams are like, candidly.
Do you want to
And
do you want to kind of expand more on the scientific approach? Because I think this was something that maybe we touched on a little bit the last time we had you on is how do you apply the scientific approach? Because I think you touched on a little bit of how people kind of will seem sciency, but then don't really properly apply the science. You know, they might jump to conclusions as what I think you kind of were alluding to. How do you go about using the scientific approach and to try to really understand what is going on there instead of in some ways sometimes we can use science to confirm our previous biases, or when we look at the data our biases color what we see out of the data, not really understanding what the data is saying or what the analysis that we ran actually says. And we draw different types of conclusions because I do think there are oftentimes myths when it comes to or misconceptions of of science or analytics where we don't properly say for the classic one, correlation doesn't equal causation. And just even understanding simple things for me, that's like, okay, when I hear like, okay, this is correlated, I actually want to ask the next question of like, okay, so what's the correlation? Because even if it's statistically significant, let's say the correlation is like a point 0.3 or something like that. That just means it's what, like, there's a what, 30% correlation there, like that, and that is can be significant, but that's not like a really strong correlation like you would think a 1-to-1. So because, if we start looking at some of the bat speed numbers and all this sort of stuff, everybody talks about, more bat speed is better. Okay, like in general, yes, but that's not telling the whole story, right? And so I guess that would be, I guess, to give an example of what I'm trying to drive at with my question when it comes to like, how do you go about looking at science and what are some of the misconceptions that people have?
I don't go about looking at science in any special way.
Mhm.
I think that the scientific approach in general, like the general sort of approach of have some sort of informed guess, a hypothesis about how things may be working, maybe multiple of them, and then test it. In this case, because you don't generally go out and test things proactively, what you can do is search the data for natural experimentation um, inputs and outputs, right? So you search for you hope for natural experiments where there are different approaches.
Could you give
I
an
know I'm picking
example
great. It's
of,
it's so I'll say this. I
yeah,
would love to give an example, but I will have to be kind of cagey about the sort of things we're looking at, right? Like I'm not going to
well,
talk
maybe
about.
not so much like what you looked at when you were with the Astros, but if you were to, with the publicly available data currently, what could be one example of of a way someone could do what you're talking about themselves if they wanted to like do like if you were to give a tutorial, a real
Hmm,
basic tutorial, what would a basic tutorial example look like?
hmm. So okay, I think the bat speed data here are really instructive, or they are rich with um, unexplained sources of variance.
Hmm.
So, okay, I went over this example, I think, or this system in the Rates and Barrels podcast because um, it's actually really clear and straightforward one. Um, there is a hope that having quote unquote bat speed can tell you a lot about essentially the maximum power of a player, right?
Mhm.
Um, the maximum power output of a player, which is very similar to their max exit velocity, except it stabilizes much quicker. Because Max exit velocity for a player over, say, like a 5-year span, um, is like a single event that occurs when that player's bat at its peak velo is making square contact with the ball, right? So like that means the ball vector and the bat vector in terms of their direction at a particular instance or moment in time are collinear but opposite, right?
Hmm.
So like the bat is heading one direction, the ball is heading the complete opposite direction. Exactly that needs to happen to get like true maximum possible exit velocity, right? But the bat, you're getting the velo whether it makes contact or not. Okay, so what it sounds like is that you have a perfect reading of this batter's velocity potential, essentially, right?
Hmm.
Exit velocity potential. Well, not so fast because there is first of all variance between different pitches or swings. So the bat will be slower in some swings, faster in other swings. The reason why we can get it into in a little bit. Um, uh, there also because of the methodology employed here, is a velocity reading at different points in the swing.
Hmm.
So let's say the swing was identical, same trajectory of the bat, essentially, right, over a swing. If the ball was in a different location for different readings, the velocity would be the bat velocity measured for that swing for each one of those swings would be different. And the reason for this is because the velocity reading is the velocity at the barrel of the bat, the linear velocity at the barrel of the bat, when that point in space is closest to the ball,
Okay.
right? So if the ball is 10 feet in front of you and you've made your swing, it would be at the end of your swing, right? If the ball is like 10 feet behind you, if it's way behind you, it would be at the beginning of your swing. Do you see?
Right.
Um, and so because the bat velocity is changing over time, over a swing, you're not actually capturing the exact same moment in time for the swing. Now, also batters are dynamic, right? Like, or swings are dynamic. They have to reach the ball in different places in space, and I don't just mean XZ, so laterally and up down, but also front back, right?
Mhm.
Also Y. Um, and so I'm just explaining this system is like it's a really complicated system. Um, and this is why I appreciate the challenge that MLB had when trying to summarize um, an individual swings in terms of its velocity with an individual point. When really you want to, you may want to characterize it differently. I'll just put it at that. But that is one way to summarize it, right? Is to give it this bat velocity value. Um, anyway, so okay, scientifically, how would you approach this? Well, you have individual swings, and then there's different features that are associated with those data, right? There's where the pitch was in space, there's how hard it was thrown, there's maybe some movement on the pitch, there's the count, there's the batter, right? And so these are other variables that you want to understand in terms of their contributions to the bat velocity, right? So, scientifically speaking, here, if you could go out and then tell the batter, um, control for individual batters and then control for count, you could collect as much data as you wanted. But in reality, what you have, just like every other problem in baseball, is just a bunch basically of historical data with variable context. And you hope that if you look over various contexts, you'll know those contexts predict like performance, essentially, right? So in this particular case, what you would probably want to do is understand the causal chain of events. What is making the bat speed faster or slower? Right? It's not like the bat speed is changing the count. The count is changing the bat speed. You know this because the count occurs before the swing, right?
Hmm.
The count is the state that precedes the swing. So you can start to think of things in terms of like causal inference here. What must be what is known before and what must be causing things downstream. And then start to figure out, well, maybe like the count and where it's thrown have something to do with the bat velocity, right? Like maybe if it's thrown inside, you have to go faster, you have to speed your bat up, because you if you're going to hit it at all, you have to hit it out in front of you, right? um a- anyway, I what I mean to say is like you're talking in this case about a bunch of different variables, um and testable hypotheses about why the bat speed specifically would be um, would be correlated with or driven by other things. And so you set up the experiment so that like you know what must precede other things, and then what might or might not be causal or simply correlated. So I've it's hard to like describe how you set this up in general, but like or even specifically for this problem over like a podcast. But I think trying first to understand the the potential sources of variance, right? Um, and I've not outlined them all. Like I said, count, where, how fast, batter. Is that it? You tell me. Like maybe the preceding pitch matters too. How hard the pitcher can throw, maybe that matters, right? Like so, you got to think about this stuff. Um, And when I say that, I think it's important to think about things in terms of like first principles. It's that it is fairly trivial to take like a really powerful, gradient boosted machine, for example, and throw like all the variables at it. And then you can do a feature importance ranking, which just kind of tells you the gain for each one of these features across all the various binary splits, etc. And that tells you something. It's kind of important, but doesn't really tell you everything, because which features are more important for like just sliders, for example? Well, then you'd need a separate model. Do you want separate models for all these? I don't know. If you want to understand the system entirely, then you want it all thrown into one. So I guess my point is like, I know I'm rambling a bit here, but my point is that um, you learn something about associations with the black box models, and they can point you in the right direction. But I think you want to go a step further and try to understand the why by setting up experiments in terms of causal chains.
I wanted to lead. Oh, go ahead.
In looking at population averages or taking a look at things on an individual level. So from a bat perspective, there's obviously they show Stanton as the highest bat speed and Arias have the lowest bat speed, but they also swing different bats. I imagine that Stanton swings a heavier bat, which also deals a lot more with what his power potential could be versus a lighter bat. I could swing a wiffle ball bat 90 miles an hour, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that makes me a good MLB hitter. Due to those different sources of variance, do you find that there's more value, like I said, in the population, or is it better for us to be looking more at an individual level and take a look at some more distributions intraswing?
Um, that's an interesting question. I mean, generally, the more granularity, the better, because you can always aggregate from it. Like you can get the averages from it. Um, and it's important to learn like intra subject variance too. Not just what's the like mean effect of this player, this thing. Um, but yeah, I mean, look, it would be cool if we had the bat dimensions and knew where in space the contact was made. You can kind of infer that actually, like if when contact was made, if you know something about like what the swing length was, and right, like what the bat speed was, if you assume starting from zero and like constant acceleration stuff, um, yeah, you see where I'm going with this. Like the ball trajectory, right, and you don't make contact somewhere along that. They'll put some constraints on things, and so you could probably make like an assumption about where in space for the actual contact events. Um, anyway,
Well,
like
we're talking with publicly available data, right? Because
oh
I
yeah,
assumed, I assumed because I have flight scope, or what, at least me and Robert have talked about how good of the quality of the data. But I know with even TrackMan, they read contact points. Now, how accurate the contact point is, because I just assumed that was publicly available. I didn't know that they hid some of they didn't give you the full
So
out of
two
TrackMan.
features for publicly available data.
Hmm.
There's what they call bat speed. I think that's what they call it. And that's what I described earlier, which is for contact events, it's the velocity in the frame immediately preceding contact.
Right, because now we're talking about Hawkeye. We're not talking about the radar
right.
units, right? Because radar units are, and I don't know how much you know about, because I don't know a ton other than like the radar unit. Its frequency of measurement, right, is going to be different, right? Because that's what you're talking about with Hawkeye, because
So Hawkeye
it's
is
based. It's what?
yeah.
Yeah.
It's
So it's going to be frame rate based, and so whereas radio waves, I think, have a different um granularness to them, right? It's going to be based upon frequency. Like, we can all understand pictures, but like I don't understand frequency as much. And so like its ability to calculate where a contact point is, I don't know how accurate. But to me, this is also where it seems to make sense. I don't know. Do pro organizations use both now? Still, do they still use their stadium TrackMan units and Hawkeye, or do they just not? Or is that a
yeah, no
I would
comment.
assume I would assume they do. Like, why wouldn't you? I mean, that would make no sense. Oh, we got this new toy. Just forget about the old one. Like, you would assume you would sit there and try to understand, because they each show different things, and that would be, at least to me, where it's like, okay, my radar unit is good at saying one thing, and then I can calibrate it, since we also have a ton of historical data with this old unit. We know what it's like, strengths and weaknesses are, and then we can compare it against the new system. And so to me, that's where, like, okay, contact points, because I'm also, in some ways, for us low budget people, I guess you could say, who happen to have like a flight scope and a bat sensor, what can we do with these types of things, even with what you're talking about? Like, because I think where this, I might be jumping way too far ahead, but I'm always sitting there thinking, as a coach, okay, how does this affect my player development? How does this affect like the things that we look at? Because obviously, blast data is not the same as Hawkeye data, and to think they're the same, to think that your 80-mile-an-hour bat speed on blast is the same thing as what Carlos Stanton is doing, is a fundamental category error or something like that. So I don't know. I might be jumping too far ahead here. Sorry if I went too far ahead, but at least so contact points are not publicly available, is basically what we're saying.
No, so it's just bat speed and what they call swing length, which is the cumulative distance of the head of the bat traveled from like time point A to time point B.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
And that in itself, I found interesting, because Garrett and I have talked about that before, of swing length. And typically, like, guys who are taller typically will have longer swing lengths. And we're answering the question of, is it because they have longer levers, or is it because they're swinging, a longer bat?
I mean, because that was the interesting thing with we were looking at Jose Altuve, and you compare him to Luis Ariz as an example, or even maybe Quan. Like, Altuve, for being a small guy, has a longer swing length, and this is where I also think swing length really doesn't matter as much as we think it might mean something, because clearly it means something, because Luis Ariz, he does something with the fact that there's some significance to the fact that he has the shortest swing length. But it could also be a measurement thing, right? Back to what you're saying of where is the contact happening. Luis Ariz might just happen to contact the ball deeper in the zone, therefore his swing length is shorter than a lot of the other guys. Maybe going back to what you were saying with Jose Altuve, he tends to hit for more power, which probably means that he's contacting the ball further out in front of the plate. Because going back to what you're saying, because this was the thing with
or chasing stuff 2 feet off the zone that he has a special ability to make contact on. Mm-hmm. And so he does it more often because he knows he can.
Right.
And then when you have to go that far, your arms go all the way out, right? Adapting to where the pitch is now that you've seen a longer slice of the trajectory, you know that it's probably going to be more outside. Some guys can do that, and very few can and be successful. But he can, and so yeah, it's basically a mixture of effects, which is why a mixed effects model is quite good at capturing things like the effect of lateral distance, height, velocity of the pitch, etc.
So by mixed methods approach, are you talking back to the analysis that you'd run to tell you kind of the weighting of how, what has the most influence on a thing? Is that what you mean, or what do you mean by?
Yeah, I am arguing on behalf of mixed effects models, which are very powerful. And there are many different flavors of them and different designs. You could say I want to model all of these effects marginally. You can look at the interaction of them and stuff. This is not a specific suggestion for this specific problem so much, even though I do suggest mixed effects models for this problem. Doesn't always tell you that. It doesn't necessarily tell you the causal direction of things. So first principles problems are still there, or like the causal chain of events, like uncertainty is still there. But yeah, I think when you've got a complicated system, so often you want to start with just like a linear effects model to help get a sense of what the relative effect sizes, variances are for, for different things. What is like maybe Luis Arias not only has a shorter bat length in general, but even once you control for where he does hit the ball, maybe it's still quite short, right? So it could be like you could say that a player has a certain swing length because of where they hit the ball. Maybe that explains all of it, where they hit the ball. Or maybe some of it also has to do with their load and how far back their bat is, and their actual bat path. Some guys more golf it, right? And they've got the kind of loft. Some guys are more straight throughout, right? That's a shorter path. Also gives you less time to accelerate. But anyway,
I mean, those are some of
the a bunch here.
Well, it's okay. To jump in though, I think going back to the bat speed stuff, what I at least saw when we first got a hold of the bat speed sensors way back with Zepp and whatever, the numbers would change based upon the location, like what you were saying before. So anybody who's actually picked up these sensors and not just hit off of a tee and just put it in one spot the whole time, and you start manipulating where you set the ball and where you place it and the height and all this sort of stuff. I saw, at least with Zepp, I had a higher bat speed on balls that were down, and then to something that was in, and then also based upon location. And so, or depth of contact. And so it's kind of to your point of when we start looking at these numbers, I guess part of what I want to say is that whenever I see these aggregate numbers, I kind of at the beginning I more kind of question them as to what, because people go out and make claims, well, bat speed's good. It's like, okay, but you have to have some sort, you need more context in that, because this isn't quite like
also pitching. What's the cost of within player?
Mm-hmm.
What is the correlation between bat speed within player and other things?
Right.
Whiffs, poor contact, right? Like how well can you score? Things like that. And I'm not saying that I'm not saying that there's a huge cost to bat speed. Like, don't get me wrong. There is some cost to it. In general, yes. Like, if you can swing the bat at an elite velocity, you're probably going to be better off than if you can't, because it's very hard to get the other skill sets, and that one locked down gives you max potential on certain things. But like to your point, you do want to characterize the trade-offs essentially that come with a certain strategy. So if for example, you're you keep everything else constant, and there were no costs. Of course, just adding velo is undeniably better, right? Like it's unquestionably a viable strategy, right? And that you would suggest. But if there are trade-offs, just what's the scale? And are those trade-offs perhaps really severe for certain types of players?
Mm-hmm. Well, I just think from either a player or coaching standpoint, when we're trying to achieve our goals of performance, if we focus on secondary things, meaning that are loosely correlated, and we start chasing that thing, then we get further away from the actual thing that we're trying to improve. And so I think that's kind of my thing that I'm at least trying to put out there is like we need a more
Goodard's law.
nuanced, huh? Which law?
Goodard's law. Yeah, like when the measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure.
Oh yeah, good hearts. Yeah, yep. Yeah, and that's kind of where I'm like, okay, I'm not anti bat speed, but I don't think everybody needs to have needs to be in the like the 100th percentile of bat speed in order to be good, or 90th or whatever. And that's more the thing of like, again, going back to trying to modulate people, like the discussion from being like bat speed good, bat speed bad. It's like, well, how does this actually fit within the broader thing, and what are the things? Okay, now that we're talking about bat speed more and we're more aware of it, we're better able to measure it. Now, how do we start to utilize it more effectively? Because that was always the thing when the bat sensors first came out was, okay, how are we going to use this data in an effective way? Like, great, it's giving us a number, but are we going to just chase the number, or are we going to figure out how to utilize that number to help us improve performance or and whatnot? And so I think that's going back to what you were talking about before in the analysis phase, and talking about the context and the importance of the context and really understanding the context. It made me think of Nikolai Bernstein's like, no national phenomenon can be understood without carefully considering how it emerged. And I think that's kind of going back to the same piece of like, okay, first, before we start trying to determine what we're going to do, we need to instead first understand what is going on. And if we can first understand what is going on and let the data show us what is going on, then we can better figure out how we want to get to the place that we want to go. And so that at least to me is where what I want to try to flesh out more, make people more aware of like, okay, before you start doing anything with the data, first try to understand what is the data showing you, what are the different ways that you can start looking at the data to help better understand what is actually occurring. So, using like what you're talking about, like a mixed model, seems to be like a better way to glean understanding of what is going on in this observed phenomenon that we're looking at and here being hitting.
Yeah, I agree. And kind of switching domains slightly and going to, talking about pitching. This is a extremely well fleshed out system, I would say. 4-seam fastballs, ride is good. Right? Okay, ride is good. But if you knew nothing else about the pitcher, maybe the only thing you'd want to know is ride, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or sorry, if you knew nothing else about the pitcher, let me rephrase that. If you knew nothing else about the pitcher, maybe you had to make some decisions about who's on your roster, for example, maybe you would have some sort of like ride threshold or something, right? But in reality, you could have good ride that is relative to your slot, to your arm slot, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you also want to know the release characteristics of the ball. So as it turns out, you could have mediocre ride marginally that is quite good from your slot, right? And so this now tells you, well, the system's more complicated than just ride. Yes, more ride is good, but what constitutes good is conditional on where you release it. Then maybe ride doesn't matter that much if you can throw 105. Or maybe if you throw 105, it doesn't matter that much if you have no ride whatsoever. And so these are the various things that all play into the performance of a particular pitch type. And there's way more than just that. So what I mean to say is I think you're absolutely right in saying when a new tracking technology enters the research domain, it's I think very easy for early adopters to fall into the trap of one-dimensional thinking, which is, in the pitching example, ride is good. Therefore, if you don't have this threshold of ride, we don't like you. When in reality, it's a piece of a system that you want to understand dynamically. What conditionals, or rather, given a particular conditional, what constitutes good, right? And that's where you always want to get. You really want to make sure that you do want to do the initial analysis of like just this thing. If all we knew now that we have this new tracking technology, just this, what does it say? However, let's do the real research now and see how it fits into the broader system and how the other pieces in this system interact with this feature to produce results.
And the other part, I want to make a quick funny comment. So like when you mentioned like, hey, you have to have a ride threshold, I immediately thought of like, going to like Six Flags or a similar theme park as a kid going, hey, you must be this tall to ride this ride. And so there's that misconception there too. Because then I thought, from a player development, what if an org's philosophy or a team, going back to like a college level, a school's philosophy was swing the bat as hard as you can. We don't care about anything else. Just when you're up at the plate, I want you to put full force into your swing. Then you ask that question, well, how much is that going to affect other factors that are related to it? Like similar, we know that the pitching side, throw your fastball as hard as you can, or throw your pitches as hard as you possibly can. How does that affect other things like command, movement, things like that? Versus, on the flip side, hitting, swing the bat as hard as you can. How does that affect, contact? How does that affect maybe over time, with pitchers being fatigued over time? How does that affect hitter fatigue over time? If the philosophy was just simply swing the bat as hard as you can. And I think if we, from an analyst perspective, we find some way to say, hey, like we're just focused on bat speed, and maybe we can see, who knows, maybe it could be positive, but it also could be negative, and see like the effects between the two and say, okay, like this is why it's not focused on just one metric.
Yeah. I just want to say that you could tell somebody to swing as hard as they can, and that may actually make them swing not as hard.
Right.
And so there is a place here for biomechanics, for coaching, that is totally outside of the realm of like the spreadsheet analyst, right? And so somebody needs to know the human body. Somebody needs to know what long-term training regimens are associated with like actual increases in the metric. And this is even now you're still like potentially running into the trappings of chasing the metric. I think, and frankly, in baseball, often like, yeah, throwing harder is better. Yeah, swinging harder is better. So it is pretty much that simple. But you still want to understand the system, and super importantly to the point that I started with here, you understand how to get there mechanistically. And that was like that has generally been outside of my domain, but I now have an appreciation for it in terms of that piece needs to be there.
I mean, because the one element with what Robert was saying, and even what you're saying, is early on, I think you can do these simplistic things, especially if nobody else is doing it. Like you have the first mover's advantage, but once it becomes commonplace, and it's kind of the same thing with analytics, right? The first movers in analytics, they could give you very simplistic things, and it would have a big advantage. But now that almost everybody has analytics, now it's about deriving new insights that are more nuanced, that actually capture more of the variation. That's where you're going to actually see those bigger gains, you could say, and that's where you actually have the advantage. And so I think that's where we're starting to get into the fact that the field is starting to mature more. And so now these deeper insights that in some ways to me are more interesting, because I think that was the criticism of, especially that players would have, of the analytics guys, or the way that the front office would go about things, is like, I know I'm a good baseball player, but because I don't fit this the metrics that they're looking for, like I don't have a spot. And then all of a sudden, I don't know which teams, but we'll just throw this out there as an example because it seemed like that was the case for a while. It was like the Rays were really good at picking up the, the types of players that everybody thought weren't any good, but didn't fit the traditional mold that was pretty common at the time. Now I don't know if that's still true, but this goes to show, like, going back to what I think we like a lot on this podcast, of it being ecological, being adaptable and dynamic, and that the systems are dynamic. And that's where remembering that, and that's what the whole reason why, Max, the first time I reached out to you was because, like, the feel that you had about your approach to analytics felt very ecological. Like, because even the things that you're talking about, the whole thing about, like, the context, knowing the context and how that shapes everything, to me feels very ecological. The fact that things are dynamic, again, is another ecological concept. And I think that's for me where remembering that, okay, we have a dynamic system, but how can we use, to me, analytics was always this thing that is this powerful tool that we can use to better understand things. And then once we understand things, then we can make better evaluations of things. And so that to me is where I see, like, a lot of the power of, like, what we're describing here, with what we can do.
Yeah, I'm with you. I have a background in science. I was a neuroscientist before I got into baseball, and you have to enter the series of inquiries with a respect for the complexity of the system. Otherwise, you will absolutely find yourself, you know, realizing that you're kind of in over your head early on. So, asking good questions from subject matter experts that have been around for a really long time, reading history of the research, all that stuff, super important before you go on and, try to do anything that actually moves the needle. You can do idle research projects. You can replicate things that have been done before. And I think that's actually quite good for, like, building up your chops in both programming and understanding of the system. But when you want to make a conceptual advance, it just takes longer, and that's okay.
To that point about conceptual advance, and it could be in bat speed, it could be in different pieces. Where do you think there's a current hole in where analysts are looking that you wish somebody would start rooting around, some little part of the forest that maybe nobody's gone over and touched that you would really like to see?
I really love that question. So many things, man. I think that the consensus approaches towards principally conceptualizing and then attempting to research for tunneling are fatally flawed. And I would say that should be reconsidered from the ground up. There's a reason that these approaches have not yielded anything. So I would say that I think that there are certain domains where there remains a data gap, and this is essentially just game calling in general. That's interrelated to, or sorry, that's very much related to tunneling and understanding a pitcher's arsenal. But that's also very much understanding, like, a batter's swing shape and stuff. And so on some level, it's like you can't really it's very hard to assess a catcher's game calling until you can assess the things that they are calling. And so that leads me to I think that should be on the public side a area where there could be some serious improvement. I had some echo there for a moment.
All good. Go for it, AJ. I was gonna say, unmute yourself. Go ask your question.
Yeah, you're the culprit.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say I'm glad you brought up those pieces, and that's something that's really interesting. And I think a lot of it, at least from my experience, like you talked about, comes from what has been the legacy system of measurement and looking at things. So the thing you first talk about from a tunneling standpoint, everything has been built out and conceptualized from a either straight behind pitcher view or behind a catcher view, where a batter in the box is not viewing that the same way. It's not viewing it like it would be from a person point of view from behind either spot. Like they're viewing the ball from an angle, or they're looking at it from a tilted head view. And I think a lot of what we understand and look at from a tunneling perspective is a pitching ninja view, where it's the straight behind view. It's, oh, how long does this ball stay on the same path? But the batter is actually not perceiving the ball in that way. And they might be adjusting their swing shape based off of how the ball is crossing the XZ median as it crosses kind of either from behind them or in front, or from their midline away from them. So I'm curious, I guess, the follow up of, and you don't have to share because this is kind of asking you to open up the kimono a little bit, but how would you go about starting to reconceptualize that whole idea of tunneling and what that new approach would kind of bring towards starting to understand it from a more first principles standpoint?
And even to jump in there on that question, what are some of the flaws? I mean, I can think of some too, if on top of that. But I want to first hear, what are your, what makes you kind of bring out that whole, like, okay, the whole premise, or several of the premises underneath the idea of tunneling are flawed. What are those things that you see that are flawed on top of what AJ was saying there?
I will get to that question, but I want to say that the best tunneled pitch is a pitch that's identical to the last one, using conventional notion of what tunneling is. If you throw the same exact shitty pitch twice, the second one's probably going to get hit better than the first one would have, right? So tunneling isn't just how much of the trajectory is within some distance, right, of the prior trajectory. Anyway, so let's take a step back and get to Garrett's question about what I think is flawed with it. What I think is flawed with it is that the assumption in this framework is that the batter expects a certain pitch which has already been delivered by that pitcher, or they expect a certain pitch which could be delivered by that pitcher. So if they expect a certain pitch from that particular pitcher, do you think that the batter really knows the pitch shapes from that pitcher? Is that the prior? Is that the expectation?
I mean, I'm trying to think about that. I don't know. I don't think, I do think, here's what I know, that what the expectation of the batter plays a huge role into what they're going to see and or swing at. So I might deviate from what you're asking. So if that's good enough for you to continue your line of thinking, I'm not going to go in with
I think it's
thoughts.
It's essentially, what's the batter expecting to see? What are they expecting to see? And then now that they do say, now, okay, they have some expectation about what they're expecting to see. And now that they have seen a pitch, how does that change their expectation?
I mean, and I think that's
so sorry, now that they have seen some of a pitch, they have to make a guess about where it's going to go. How does that change their expectation? I'll just say broadly, my problem with the way the reason I think that tunneling research has been fatally flawed is that it fails to appreciate the way that people actually go about constructing their expectations for things. Um, I don't really want to get into too much detail about this, but I think that there is a lot of room for rethinking how a batter expects, um, how the batter goes about constructing their expectations, and then what the update process is for that batter. And we know that times through the order matters. Exposure to a particular pitcher matters, right? So at a crude level, first time through the order, you perform worse than you do second. Third time you perform, um, you know, I got that all backwards. First time you have your best performance, it gets a little worse. Second time, third time a little worse, and so on, right? But this is also correlated with the number of pitches you see. So is it the number of pitches that the pitcher's thrown? Is it the amount of individual pitches? Well, those things are all investigatable, right? Like there are natural experiments out there. There are batters third term through the order who've only seen 3 pitches, right? Made contact on the first one each time. Maybe it was bad contact, whatever. Anyway, what I mean to say here is, like we have some understanding of like what the variance is in terms of number of pitches that are seen, number of pitch types that are seen, and the quality, essentially decay curve. Does it decline over time? And generally, pitches don't decline in quality that much, like not enough to explain the overall drop in pitching performance or boost in offensive performance. Clearly, the batter's learning something. What are they learning? What are they learning? That almost certainly has something to do with tunneling. And I know that seems like orthogonal, but I don't think it is. I think they're actually very much related because the batter over time is starting to have, they have some initial, essentially prior, right? Some expectation system, but that gets updated over time. And part of you could look, think of it this way. Here's a really simple system, right? Like maybe what's really going on is that batters are better able to distinguish between the individual pitch types because they learn the shapes better, and so they have a more faithful prior expectation for what the pitch shape should be, and so they can distinguish them more easily over the course of the trajectory. And so they perform better over time because they make the distinction earlier more correctly, right, between the different pitch types and then therefore where they're going to go. So that's one possibility. I guess what I mean to say here is like, let's stop thinking about tunneling in terms of just the last pitch. Let's start thinking about it in terms of like how you build up your expectations and then how you update those expectations given the additional information you've received over your various at-bats and pitches, et cetera.
I guess here's my questions, unless Robert, you had something there.
No, I want you to ask your question, then
Okay. Well, I mean, this might be a little rant here for a second. So, because as you're talking about tunneling, because my understanding of tunneling is not just what the prior pitch is, it's how the other pitches play off of the other ones. I mean, my issue with tunneling is that that's not even possible because we already know that there's variation between each throw. So, I mean, just looking at the data itself will tell you that there's variation. So what's the chance that you could actually tunnel it? I have no idea, right? Because your release point for your breaking ball is going to be different than your fastball. It's just, and yes, it is a small, minute difference. But if we're talking about even now, I'm going to go into a little bit ecological dynamics and what it thinks or how it sees the world, right? From a sensitivity standpoint, a system that's highly sensitive is probably going to be sensitive to the point where it can pick up those subtle differences. And so much so because of those subtle differences even are picked up in terms of where the ball is going to end up, right? So a small variation in your release height and your release horizontal release is probably going to alter slightly as well where the ball ends up. And usually, again, a batter, his swing take is also going to be sensitive enough to pick up on those things. And so this is where, to me, that the notion of tunneling is flawed just out of the initial component of it. And going back to what you're kind of talking about too, of like anticipation, I think is oftentimes the thing that makes hitters the most susceptible to a whiff is their expectation. And so that's where, again, to me on a coaching standpoint, I'm actually trying to get guys to sit on pitches less, because the whole reason that they're whiffing is because they're sitting on pitches. There's a certain element where you do kind of have to, but when a guy is hitting the best, when I sit,
Could you explain that a little more?
which part to get a
What do you mean you're whiffing more if you are taking
sitting
more
on a
pitches?
pitch? So, for example, you will chase pitches because you're sitting. Let's say you're
Sitting. Sorry, I thought you meant like taking more pitches. Anyway, go ahead.
No, yeah, you're swinging at more balls that you shouldn't be swinging at, or you're getting fooled on the pitches that you're swinging at. Because when I sit in on, when I went to pitch 360, the pro pitching coaches are talking like, man, when a hitter's hot, it does not matter what we throw them. It like when Freddie Freeman's hot, and then they talk about like when we talk to some of those hitters, they're not sitting on pitches. The best guys are not sitting on pitches. But when you listen to a broadcast, what are they saying? Oh, he was sitting on it there. So what does that do into the minds of all the youth and all the coaches that are watching who are not in the pros in the know? They're sitting there like, oh, this is the strategy. And in my mind, from experience, this is a low-level strategy that is a Band-Aid to get you out of a slump. It's not the high-level strategy that is used by hot hitters. They don't sit on pitches. And what that allows them to do is it allows them to naturally react to the things that you're talking about of, from an ecological perspective, we talk about things in terms of the athlete becoming attuned, highly sensitive to the invariant information that specifies what is about to happen or what is currently happening. And then the second component of that is not just your ability to pick it up, but it's your ability to interact directly with that. So in my mind, it's calibration. So, like it's a mapping piece. So when I touch here, that's actually where the toucher actually occurs. So the best athletes, when Freddie Freeman is hot, as an example, he is highly attuned and highly calibrated. And when I go more into if I'm thinking more about it scientifically, because we just did a podcast on square one, and we're trying to figure out like what are the mechanisms there. We understand these ideas of like resonance and like frequency, and also because when you look into the biomechanical stuff, they talk about like frequency or a lot of coaches talk about rhythm and timing. And that also has to do in some ways with like oscillations and gait and all this sort of stuff as just an example of what I'm trying to describe here. And so in my mind, when the system is more attuned, and what I mean by that is like they're on the same wavelength as the pitcher, because every pitcher has their own natural cadence, their own tendencies. And then like the more that a hitter, going back to what you're talking about, the more a hitter sees another pitcher, the more that they're able to get in tune with their cadence, right? You could actually.
It's like, and sorry, but just to interrupt and ensure that I'm understanding you correctly. I think I do. What you're essentially saying is the more that a batter can be sensitive to the signal or various signals that are informative on what they're about to see, because it is largely hidden information until the pitch is actually delivered, right? There's then a little bit in the delivery, then a little bit in where you actually released it, and then some bit of information over the trajectory, quite a lot. But then by the time it's actually gone over the plate, that's all the information, right? And so what you're saying is that it's the batters observing this, and you're saying that they have less and less error in their observation, because all batters are seeing this, they're all eyes, but some aren't like detecting.
They're not connecting with it. Yes, detecting or connecting with it, because the way that I put it is, or the way that I think about it, because again, let's go back to your initial, you steel manning it back to me. I think the way that I'm thinking about this or what you're describing, I want you to think of it in terms of macro to micro. So what's occurring on the macro scale works its way all the way down to the micro scale. So as the athlete has more experience, they're going to be picking up things, but then also in the moment, the things are going to be informing them as things are going on. And they're able to pick up and connect with that information. But the way that I begin to conceptualize it more from I want to say like biological standpoint, less mechanistic, is that when the system becomes, and it's not just visual, it's the whole perceptual system is picking up the information and is able to kind of synchronize its movement to the other thing. And that's where, like, again, going into more like chemistry and these other sort of sciences kind of help with this analogy a little bit more versus just something that's very mechanistic. Because where, for example, one of the people who are kind of a little bit not totally bought into the ecological approach, Bobby Tewksbury, I had a conversation with him. He's like, but I can see what's going on and I know what's about to happen. So there's certain, going back to what you're describing, it's kind of the signal through the noise, right? So there's all this noise, which in some way is just non-specifying information, right? And then there's specifying information, which is the signal. The best athletes are the ones that are able to pick up on that signal, and that signal, they're able to pick up the signal through the variation because there's still a signal through that variation. And so when we're talking about, let's say, for example, how you're going to be able to hit the ball, there's a control law. Let's take it to, this is how I understood tau, was I naturally picked it up when I was driving. Tau is the rate of expansion. If you can couple your movement to the rate of expansion, if I wanted to maintain my distance away from another car, I just put the expansion at 0, right? So that's how, and that's kind of the same thing as like a hitter is picking up on a variable that they're using to control their movement. And once the elite guys are the ones that are able to figure out what that variable is. Less elite guys are going to be picking up on specifying information. Let's say they're not like, a Luis Arise or a Aaron Judge or whatever, but they're still like a really good pro guy. They're using specifying information, but their specifying information is not, it's not as higher order because it's more niche, you could say. So there's some sort of higher level variable that guys are able to pick up on that actually accounts for, that it's able to handle that variation that we see. And so at least that's my understanding from an ecological perspective, like what's going on, that there is this thing, but it is a thing that the organism can only kind of pick up. You can't necessarily quantify it. You can't be like, you should attend to this thing. Cause that's what, like from a coaching standpoint, when I understand ecological.
That will vary from pitcher to pitcher, right?
But what about
pitchers
the guys,
will have,
what about the hitters that hit a lot of pitchers really, really well? If that makes sense,
right?
Like they don't have like this obvious weakness, if that makes sense. So that's where I'm saying there's a higher, because hitting a ball is hitting a ball, right? And so, and the ball moves and it has only, because it's constrained by the characteristics of the ball is going to constrain what it can do. And so the best hitter, whatever, the best hitter is going to be able to attune to the variables and adjust their movement based upon that or couple their movement to that. And so that's where it changes from a coaching perspective, what it is what my goal is as a hitter. All the information in my mind that the analytics and all these other sort of things do is just help me, like the Band-Aid that I see of like sitting on a pitch. It is a bridge to get to the higher thing. Because if we can't start hitting the ball, we can't do the higher order thing. So sitting on a pitch is a less effective strategy than just being ready for whatever may come. And so
Maybe. So I'm going to disagree with you somewhat there.
Sure.
I think that you are absolutely right. The best players are able to adaptively make contact with essentially whatever pitch comes their way. The absolute top tier level players. There's a bit of a survivorship bias problem there, though, which is that capacity may not be available to most people, even most major leaguers. I don't know. So I'm not saying that you are wrong, and I actually take back what I said about disagreeing. What I'm saying is that an alternative description of the system here overall across players may be that yes, you're absolutely right. The best players do this, but maybe it's because the best players can, and that it is very, very, very challenging. You'd know better than me, but to actually stay in tune or whatever. Wow, I'm not describing that well. To adapt, and that it may be like a band-aid, but also an effective strategy for some to basically sit the pitches that they can hit because they can track them better. Now, I would love to hear your comments on that in general.
Well, no, I mean, I think that is the thing of the art of coaching or whatever, is that you have to fit a strategy to the actual person that you're working with. And I mean, this is to AJ. This is also why AJ is here, is because he understands the ecological approach well. Is so if I kind of don't describe something super well, feel free to jump in and help me out here, or kind of bring it back ecologically. But as I see it and understand it, the whole goal from an ecological perspective is for the individual to find their functional fit. And so with that, it is based upon the action capabilities of that individual. And so part of what you're becoming attuned to is the pitches that you can hit the best. And so, for example, you lay off the pitches that you can't handle as well. But there are certain things, because you have to, right? All these guys, they're playing in these high leverage environments. And what I mean by that is that everything that they do is either making them money or costing them money. And they all these guys understand this. In order to keep playing the game and to keep advancing, they have to understand that there's a cost benefit analysis of striking out and putting a ball weakly in contact and throwing off their whole plan and causing a bad habit. So sometimes it makes sense over the long haul to take a pitch for strike 3 than to swing at it, and to try to work a walk, right? So there are these things of going back to what you're talking about. This is a very complex dynamic thing. But going back to like, okay, from my standpoint of when I begin to look at what is the ultimate goal of where I'm trying to go, of where we have the best performance and can we get there? To me, this is where that ideal state is. But then, and it will kind of call that an attractor state, or like a place that we're trying to go and be. Then you have to look at where you are and like, how do we get there? And so like I look at sitting on a pitch as being like the next closest attractor state. Like this ideal state that I talked about is too far away for that person. It's not attainable. It's not within their action capabilities. But this one is on the cusp or the edge of their action capabilities, or within it. Let's see if we can move over here, and then we just try to work our way to this other place. And maybe we'll never get there, and that's okay. But then it's about trying to find the functional fit and niche of that person and that individual, and where they can most thrive. And that's kind of where, going back to where analytics kind of thrives, is taking a person as they are and figuring out how to optimize them. And that there's a ton of value in that. But then it's a question of, okay, once we've squeezed all the juice out of that, is there more that we can get around the edges that can prolong a player's playing time, service time, and what they're useful for, or whatever? That's where I begin to see like ecological dynamics helps us figure out, okay, can we start moving to the next pieces? But it also goes on things like for what you're talking about, analytics, appreciating the complexity, because ecological dynamics within it is dynamic systems theory, and complexity theory is all wrapped within this, and it all has a scientific basis to it. I think bringing in those ideas and concepts is really kind of, for me, the thing of the whole purpose for this podcast. Is I don't see these ideas and concepts of appreciating the complexity in the way that you, Max, have appreciated it, is what I see is lacking the most in the baseball space. It's there. I know it exists, right? I know it exists in professional baseball. It existed, I don't think it just existed with you there, but let's just say it did. Like it at least existed while you were within professional baseball. But that's why I want to bring this out more of like, highlighting the fact of like, we need to appreciate the complexity. We need to appreciate the context, and like showing people how it's done and the way to think about it when we're starting to do our analytics. So anyways, that's my rant. Robert, I
Yeah.
think you were going to say something though. Did we, I hope I didn't move too far past it.
No, you kind of touched on it a bit, but my question regarding it is this is a little bit analytics related, a little bit ecological dynamic. So from a like, let's say we're looking at a batter scouting report. It says, let's say it's a left-handed batter, and it says, hey, he struggles with hard, low, and away. Now, one train of thought could be eventually, if the ball is kept throwing there, eventually the batter would catch on, and the outcomes would be better as the ball is kept throwing. Another one is, in terms of the opposite side of it, is, well, what if the batter just doesn't swing? Now, relating to that, in terms of that question, is going back to, again, ecological dynamics and that concept of tunneling, where Max mentioned earlier, if you see the same shitty pitch twice, you're more likely to see a better result or I guess a worse result from a pitcher's perspective, a better result from a batter's perspective if you see it that second time. So regarding that, how does that play out? Can it change, like, decay over time? Or if a batter struggles with a certain pitch in a certain location, does that stay the same, or can it adjust with certain training methods?
I mean, I think that's a question that can be investigated empirically. There's so much data, and you have been exposed to particularly valuable data because these are people specifically in development environments. I mean, one of the problems with Major League data is that this is not primarily a development environment. And so the natural experiments you see there are between generally successful players. And so you have a lower bound problem where you don't really have a real lower bound. Those data aren't there, right? Like the high strikeout and poor the high strikeout guys who are also slow, who also can't hit the ball hard, like those simply don't exist, right? Like that player does not exist in the player pool. So you in college, you kind of get some of that. I want to go back to like 2 steps just briefly, something Garrett mentioned about, maybe there being not a particularly, like a lack of sensitivity in the analyst community to the dynamics of a system and the importance of viewing things beyond, the unidimensional, beyond like unidimensional thinking. I think that part of the reason that does exist in the analyst community and like absolutely does not exist in the coaching community is coaches are very much interested in working with what they've got. And analysts are very much interested in optimizing for the absolute best player possible, right? Like, because that player does exist in Major League Baseball. Like there is a Mike Trout, there is a Jordan, there is an Aaron Judge, there is a, Shohei, whatever. They are there. But as a coach, you rarely get to work with a player like that. Players like that are going to be good no matter what they do. You got to work with players who have real world limitations, who are maybe still fantastic. And so in your mind, the conditions matter, and then the knobs that are available to you matter. And so you have to think about things in terms of trade-offs. You have to think about things in terms of interactions. And yeah, I mean, I had less of an appreciation for that before I worked for a team. I absolutely have more now because of some of the work I did, and because you start to see like most players are just simply not major leaguers when they begin playing professional ball. Even major leaguers weren't always major leaguers. The best players were, but a lot of guys, it takes time. It takes a long time. Really, really good players, seriously good players. It takes time to get there. And yeah, part of that's just in them, it's their own drive, and part of that is navigating through, this just this path, navigating this path of how to get better, piece by piece or whatever. And that's like the job of the coach. And um, what I've seen is often what coaches do. They do so much more than this, but one of the things that they do so well is provide an answer to the last mile problem. Right? Like you'll have data that gets you really far, but how do you use those data, take them the last mile for implementation to actually improve somebody? That's what coaches are like amazing at. Like a good coach is like a last problem genius, or sorry, a last mile genius. And how you actually get there, like that's so outside of my domain, man. But that's why I've come to appreciate coaches. It's like they know stuff that there just isn't really good data for. And I'll use a specific example here. There's not, generally speaking, really good high fidelity data on finger position over the delivery of a pitch, right? Like exactly where your fingers are, where pressure is being applied and stuff. A pitching coach knows that stuff, and they will be able to explain it super well. And that data just simply does not exist easily, right? And so the last mile of like, how do you get the shape? Well, the coach is filling in that. A really good coach can do it well. So anyway, just like I'm singing praises here to that whole process, because I think that's why data is not going to it does not replace a coach. It simply informs them.
I feel like that's a really good place to kind of land the plane, but I'm not gonna. We're just on the descent right now. So I wanna see AJ or Robert. Do you have any other affordances that you're seeing right now?
I had one more question, but it's kind of when the planes ended in their boarding, taking people off the flight, so we can save that for the end.
You're muted.
I was gonna say, hey, if you're ready to get us on the ground and get us to the terminal, like by all means,
Affordances there. Go. Sure, let's do it. This is more of a general question, but you mentioned that you have a neuroscience background. How has that shaped your baseball thinking?
In different ways. I have a computational neuroscience / bioinformatics background. So I would say that the piece having to do with cognition, the piece having to do with psychology, which was not actually my focus as a doctoral candidate, has informed it somewhat. In terms of thinking about reaction time decay with aging, in terms of thinking about updated beliefs, the visual system, etc. That's informed some of the background to the larger picture of my vision of baseball. Much more specifically is the tools and programming skill set. Because as a doctoral student, I worked on computational stuff, therefore had to write programs, therefore had to understand machine learning statistics, etc. And when I say understand, these are huge fields. You don't understand everything. You just have exposure to certain general things, expertise in particular things. That was really important, practically speaking. You don't have to be like a neuroscience PhD candidate to do this stuff. Most people have totally different backgrounds. A lot of people I know who do public analyst work sort of picked up their analyst chops or their programming chops sort of in service of just doing baseball stuff. So they didn't come to it with like a strong analytics background or anything. They just had to pick it up on the way in order to be able to answer certain questions with precision that only like a program or a model can provide. So I think that that's available to you too. But yeah, the broad answer is like the computational stuff mostly is what I got from my PhD. But definitely in the way I think about human behavior and cognition, that there was some of that too, for sure.
Robert, you got anything you want to throw in there?
No, I think these are all very interesting points. I guess for another question is, I guess to help board the people off the plane, as they would say, is for Max. So if you're to those analysts out there that have listened to this and are like, hey, how do I just get started into it? What's a good recommendation to do that?
It depends on what your goals are. I think if you have some pretty low level goals of just being able to like scrape some data, toy around with it a little bit, there is a book. Hold on, I think it's still free. So there. Okay, it depends both on what your goals are and what your exposure to the primary like data science or analytics programming languages would be. So first, I think if you want some familiarity with like R or Python, there are so many resources I could not possibly list them all off. You could literally just look up like Python tutorial data science and get a really simple primer on the essential functionality of those two programming languages. If you want to dive a bit deeper, but also head down a path that has a lot of the essentials in it, Jim Albert's book Analyzing Baseball Data with R is freely available. The third edition of it is. It goes over how to scrape, it goes over the basics of programming in R, and then how to scrape baseball data, and then tons and tons and tons of examples of analyses on those data that can equip you with many of the basic competencies and more complex competencies, I would say, to start to answer your own questions with data. And there's also cool visualization stuff there. But as you do this, like Google your way to solutions. When you see that there's a problem, if there's something you can't do, like almost always somebody else has encountered that problem. And one like final piece of advice here is it's so important to try to replicate other people's work. I think it can be really gratifying when you see that you get the exact same result or very similar result using newer data. It gives you an appreciation for how the sausage is made and, a particular conclusion about baseball was developed. Was that conclusion developed? What's the error around it or whatever, things like that. So yeah, I think in general, you want to start by just kind of looking up tutorials for these programming languages if you have no background. If you have some background in R specifically, that R book is great. If you want to do more Python stuff, I actually don't know the Python baseball tutorials as well. I now work almost exclusively in Python, but like the actual uh, tutorials available, I'm not the best person to answer that. I'm sure you three know more than me.
Well, I don't have much else other than to say if people like what they hear here with you, Max, where can they find you?
Um, I guess my public facing stuff is still all contained within the choice_fielder Twitter handle. These days, I'm not really doing as much public work. I've kind of taken a mental vacation from baseball thinking while I start this new chapter in my life professionally. But I definitely still talk about baseball. I just am posting less actual personal analyses. Part of it's time, part of it's needing a little break. But rest assured, this obsession of mine is a lifelong one, and at some point, I will probably just be obsessively and pathologically posting things on there again.
Well, great. I mean, we're glad that you're going to stay in it because we appreciate what you contribute. So, for everyone, appreciate you listening. Until next time.